air arms, 6-power scope. I'm going to share with you the basic way to tune a PCP air rifle. With that said, there's a few ways to tune PCP air guns, but the simplest way is with the hammer spring. Now, a lot of PCP air guns out there have adjustment and a few of them don't. And if you don't have an adjustment, you just have to find the pellet that works in them, and that's how it is, unless you do modifications internally. Now, with an air gun that is adjustable like this Air Venturi Avenger and many others out there on the market, you have a few different adjustments you can make, whether it's the regulator pressure and the hammer spring, or some guns have a transfer port like on the crawl rifles and a couple others, where you can open up the transfer port and increase the volume of air traveling through the system. Now, what happens is when the hammer spring hits the valve in an unregulated air gun, a certain amount of air comes out, and when you shoot in the shot curve, which is typically below the fill pressure, say 3,000 psi, a lot of people want to shoot at the full fill and go all the way down to get the max shot count, and that's not how unregulated air guns work. If you want to shoot for precision, which gets you nice tight groups down range, you have to shoot in the curve and get only a handful of shots depending on how much volume is in your air cylinder. And with regulated air guns, again, Air Venturi Avenger and many others out there on the market, where they have a plenum, that is a certain area of where the air is past the air cylinder, and it gets metered at a certain pressure. But with that said, if it has a hammer spring adjustment, you could pretty much tune a pellet to almost any pressure the regulator can be set at. And that's what I typically do. I don't really mess with the regulator pressure too much unless I'm testing out something. More times than not, I'm adjusting only the hammer spring. And you're probably thinking, well, why is that? Why are you only adjusting the hammer spring? Well, again, the hammer is what hits the valve, which opens up and allows the air going through the transfer port to the pellet. And if you have too much air or too little, it can really affect your range and how well it groups at a certain range. I typically shoot at 50 yards or farther, so I want to make sure that my pellets group up nice and tight. And I start with the hammer spring backed all the way out counterclockwise. Again, a lot of guns have this adjustment. I start on the low side, and then I work my way in, whatever increment you could choose, but I do usually one turn at a time to see how well the gun shoots. And what that does is creates more or less volume for the pellet going down the barrel. Now, the reason why I start on the low side, or I should say no hammer spring at all, no hammer spring tension, whatever the factory hammer spring poundage is because if you start on the high side, it'll automatically waste air out of your air cylinder because you're opening the valve too long. And then the groups down range will not look that great. So I work my way up, and typically, depending on the weather, sometimes I have to tune in for that day, even if I tuned it the day before, because of the weather change. Air density, temperature, pressure, all that stuff plays a big factor when you're messing with air. Now again, this is with air guns that have adjustment, and if you don't have adjustment, you just have to find the right pellet. And with unregulated air guns, you have to shoot in the curve, and that's that, to get the most precise shots down range and tightest groups. And that's why I believe the easiest and most basic way to tuning is the hammer spring, because everything else stays the same. You don't have to worry about always changing your pressure of your regulator, all that. As long as you're filling above the regulator pressure, the hammer spring is the only variable that day. Now, when it comes to shooting, you should either shoot at the range that you're trying to zero your scope at, or that you know for a fact that you're going to be shooting at. And that's why I'm always shooting like at 50 yards or so, personally. And a lot of times, I'll shoot out in the open just to see how well the pellet flies, whether it's straight in line with the reticle all the way through the flight path, the trajectory. And if it's not, that means the tune is not right, even in the wind. I shoot in the wind all the time. It's always windy here. Very rarely do we get a calm day. So I just stick with the hammer spring pretty much. Alright, you see my plumb line downrange at 50 yards. The wind's blowing pretty good. Let's see how well the pellet flies here. Got my reticle lined up with my plumb line. Pretty straight. I just need to adjust my reticle. And with groups downrange, when I mess with the hammer spring, when I start from all the way out and work my way in, from being counterclockwise, I'll start going in clockwise. 1, 2 turns, 3 turns, whatever to me gets the tightest groups that I want. That is usually at 50 yards about 1/4 inch groups or less, as a lot of you guys have seen how well my 22 shoots. And that's one of my favorites, the 22 Avenger. It's so easy to tune. It works just about with every pellet out there, and it's deadly accurate and precise. So I hope this video helps you with a basic tune of an air gun. Again, keep it simple is my theory. Only mess with the hammer spring. And I've had this all the way up to the max pressure of the regulator, which is 2900 PSI. That's when I got it out of the box, and it worked fine for me there. Other than that, you know, if you're messing with it and you run a tinker on down the road, then you have to start all over and find that exact volume that the pellet liked in your barrel. When you go high on the PSI like that on the regulator, you have a lot more back pressure on the regulator, and when you have 0 turns in on the hammer spring, the valve does not stay open that long. Whereas if you have it turned in 4 or 5 turns, the valve stays open longer and has more volume of air allowing through the transfer port, pushing that pellet out the barrel. But again, if you use too much turn on the hammer spring, the valve stays open too long and you're pushing air past after the pellet left the barrel, and that could cause inaccuracy and bad groups downrange. So again, this is just my personal preference, and I know a lot of you have asked for basic tuning instructions, and I hope this video helps you. As always, thanks for watching. Hope to see you on the next one.